Welcome to another episode of Jamming with Jason. Hey, today I've got a very special episode. I'm going to be talking to Dawn Vogel about something that I'm pretty sure almost every one of you is dealing with. And this is an important topic that I know lots of people are dealing with, and something that honestly I personally am not dealing with because my kids are all grown and gone. They're out of the house, right? So today we're going to talk a little bit about, how to manage in all of these different stresses and anxieties and other stuff that you're probably dealing with as you have children. You're a leader, and now all of a sudden, with the pandemic and things that we've been living through, now all of a sudden you have a whole bunch of additional roles. And how do you start becoming more adaptable and flexible so you can take care of your family as well as your career? So with that, let's roll the episode and we'll bring Dawn in. Hey Dawn, I'm so excited. Like I said, we've known each other for a while, and I really appreciate you taking time to talk about this, because as I told you before, I feel for people, I empathize for people, but I am not in this situation, right? I mean, my kids are all grown, they're gone, they're out of the house, they live in different states, and so I'm excited to just kind of go through and talk with you. So welcome today.
Thanks, Jason. I'm very happy to help and talk about wherever this goes. I know that sometimes or at least during this time, I look at various resources to find out things on how to handle it, but the reality is every case is different and you have to pick and choose whatever works for yours.
Well, I know I find myself at times like that. And so I don't know if you've kind of been there too, but it's like, you have a question and it's like, oh, let's Google it, right? Let's see what other people are doing. And that can be helpful, but sometimes it can also be, it can take you down rabbit holes that are kind of crazy, right? So like if you've ever, oh, I've got this little ailment. And so you start doing a Google search, and maybe you have a headache, and all of a sudden, 20 minutes into it, you're like, oh my gosh, I have cancer, right? Because everything always comes back to
Mhm.
cancer when you're looking for health stuff. And so I'm sure it's that way too, as you've kind of navigated through this. So, again, we've been in kind of lockdown for, or whatever we want to call it, right, for a year now. So maybe talk a little bit about, because I know, you're an executive leader, you're leading people in
Mhm.
your organization, but you also have a small child as
Mhm.
well, right? So maybe let's just get in and start talking about what are some of the challenges you've been experiencing. What are some of the things you've learned this
Mhm.
year, and maybe again, if there's even any things that you're still kind of struggling with, like,
Mhm.
how do I do this, so we can kind of share with other people and give people a resource to kind of go back to.
Definitely. So, overview, like everybody else, March of 2020, we get the word that, our offices are closing, everybody has to work from home, and school is now going to be from home as well.
Mm-hmm.
And my son is 10, he'll be 11 in a couple of months. So he's in elementary school transitioning to middle school. So I guess I don't know if it's good news or bad news, but the adults got to transition home first, and then spring break happened. So at least my husband and I had probably about a week of us working from home full time, getting everything set up. He has an office, and I'm in a spare bedroom. We had to find workspace, and then my son was on spring break. So at first we didn't have to worry about anything and we didn't know what was going to happen. And so then we found out we had to find him a space. Well,
Mm-hmm.
one of the first interesting things that happened was the first couple days when all three of us were on the internet, everybody was zooming. Then we realized things would stop and start. Well, then we had to hit the pause button and then uh, my husband had to go find us some uh, internet boosters
Mm-hmm.
and set those up in the set those up in the house. Um, and then of course when we got closer to school winding down in about June, that's when the gaming started with my son and the streaming, and then we had to readjust once again because
That was taking up more bandwidth.
that was taking up more bandwidth than Zoom meetings. So it was basically, constant adjustment. I think I would describe, if I had to give one word to this whole thing, it would have to be adaptability, and constant adapting to different situations.
Yeah, well, because it's interesting. So, like you said, you and your husband got a week or so to begin with, where okay, first off, you guys are home, then your son comes home for spring break, so he's off for a week as well, right?
Hmm.
Then he goes back to school, but then I think at that point it turns into virtual school for him.
Yes.
Then you go for a couple of months, and then all of a sudden he's off on summer break again too, right?
Yeah.
So what are some of the, I know before this we all kind of had these discrete little containers, if you will, right? You probably had a routine in the morning. You
Yeah.
get up, everybody has breakfast, whoever is going to drop your son off at school takes him to school, right? He comes back home however he comes back home, kind of thing. He might be there for an hour or two by himself, and you guys are there again in the evening. And you don't have that now, right? So you had those routines before, and now you don't. I mean, how does that impact, your work day, your husband's work day, other stuff like that as well? Because I mean, I remember when my kids were little, and it was like constant interruption,
Yep.
right? Too. So how do you kind of deal with that in trying to? We always used to talk before about work-life balance, right? And that was, now you're actually really living
Yes,
true work-life balance because you don't have that separation.
correct. I would say we had to learn very quickly how to communicate better.
Okay.
Uh, uh, what I mean by that is in you have to repeat. Like nobody knew what each other did. Like, especially for my son, he didn't understand the concept of what adults do when they're working.
Aha.
And so, like you said, the interruptions. So at first I started by saying, okay, just verbally saying to everyone in the house, I have a meeting from, 8 to 9, whatever the timing was. I have meetings, here's my schedule. And go into the room, close the door, and lo and behold, 5 minutes after I just told them I'm going into a meeting, please don't interrupt, somebody walks in. It could have been my husband. It was my husband just as much as it was my son. Although there was only one occasion where my son walked in his underwear and kind of walked into the screen. And the good news is it was people that I knew very well, had a really good relationship with. They knew I had a son, and they just kind of chuckled, and um, we went about our business. But then afterward, we had to have, another conversation about, I said, I have a meetings. I said, it's important to have boundaries.
Mhm.
And then I said, okay, so the next thing I did was got some Post-it notes, stuck them on the outside of the door for everybody to read. Well, sometimes that did not work either. People would just walk in, and then we'd have to have another conversation about, I don't understand what I need to do. And you may ask, why don't I just lock my door? Well, when we built this house, it's probably about 10 years old. Knowing that we would have children, somebody suggested you don't want to put locks on your children's doors. So you don't put locks on any of the spare
Okay.
bedroom doors. So we didn't. Well,
Okay.
turns out now locks would probably be very useful in this situation. But it just took a little bit of time. Well, a little bit, I don't think it's a little bit. It probably took months for people to understand when my door is closed and I have a Post-it note on the door, that means don't come in. And I would try to prep them, a couple minutes before, okay, guys, going into a meeting. can't, please don't interrupt me for the next hour. Need anything? Nope. Okay. And it did get better. And it just takes it takes practice. On the reverse side too, when you're home with your spouse, you're used to just coming up with you have some idea or activity you need to talk about, and you're used to just going to wander over wherever they may be in your house to talk about it with them. Well, I would do that to my husband. He would look like he wasn't doing anything, just looking at his computer. And I'm used to seeing him sitting in his office doing, personal internet searches, that kind of thing. And you just get used to just walking in and talking about whatever it is you need to talk about. Well, that's disruptive because, and I'm sure everybody feels this, you get into a flow of your work. And if you're constantly being disrupted, you eventually get very frustrated and irritable to the point where you start having some um, not heated discussions, but you just get frustrated. And since there's no one else to vent your frustrations because you're stuck in your house with your husband and son, eventually sometimes they end up being a little louder than maybe they would normally be. But you just worked through it and had communication. And I like to think, even though we had to experience some of those times at the early time of the pandemic, and my son was here and obviously seeing this, I like to think that it was actually a good thing because we all learned how to be better communicators, and how to be more respectful of just people, when they're working, when they're not working, and just being more respectful in general, meaning try to get your own frustrations under control, so that you don't take it out on others.
Yeah, well, that's really important. I think, that point that you made about the boundaries, because I always joke to my wife that I'm kind of an absent-minded professor, right? So I'm like off thinking about whatever. And it's the same thing, like what you said with your husband, right? He's sitting there and it looks like he's not doing anything. So let's just take this opportunity to talk about whatever we need to. And he's like, damn it, you're interrupting me. Well, it
Yes.
doesn't
Yep.
look like you're doing anything, right? And that idea of having those boundaries, when we were going to work, to a workplace, usually there were those physical boundaries, so it was easier for us to turn on and turn off the work brain, right?
Yes.
A lot of people would use the time traveling to work or coming home, especially the coming home, as kind of a decompressing time that you don't really
Hmm.
have now. And having those boundaries is important, right? I mean, I've worked from home for 10 years, so I'm very familiar with it. But at the same point, up until it was a little over a year ago, my wife had a job outside of the home, right? And so she had that physical separation. And so again, when she, started helping me and working with my
Hmm.
businesses, she didn't understand or have those boundaries either, right? And there would be times when all of a sudden I would have some thought at 8 o'clock at night, and it's like, oh, hey, we're just sitting here and want to talk about it. And she's like, that's business. We're not supposed to be talking about that after
Hmm.
a certain time, right? So we actually set boundaries for ourselves that if we talk about business after 6 o'clock, we have to pay our betting jar uh, a penalty, right?
Hmm.
If I say something, I have to put money in the jar so that we could kind of keep those boundaries. Because for her, it was hard to know, well, okay, when is work and when is not work, right?
Definitely. And I think adding school into that,
Uh-huh.
having a child that has school, that became even more interesting. Um, One of the things I know I did, and I believe my husband did as well, is first we had to figure out what our son's schedule was,
Hmm.
and what it meant, what kind of assistance and support we needed to provide him. And we found out, okay, he needs support from 8 to 10 o'clock in the morning, at least on the front, at least on like a year ago, on the when this first started happening. And so we both had to go to our employers or, our bosses and say, look, this is the way it is. Our kid is, in elementary school. He needs a lot of support. And so from 8 to 10, this is what we're going to do. And then we actually figured out between my husband and I think this is also very important. You do have to split the responsibilities because doing it all every day by yourself gets hard. And so you have to divide. So we figured out, okay, he's going to do the literacy and the social studies, and I'm going to do the math, the math and science. So we would split it up. But then once we had that figured out, we both went to our employers and said, we're not working from 8 to 10 in the morning because we have to help our son. And we said, you know what, we'll check our email, make sure we're not missing anything important, but for the most part, we're not available between 8 and 10. And they said, okay. But what that also meant is so between 10 and 5 or whatever the hours we were working, and then we'd have to stop, take some breaks. We need to eat too. We would need to eat, but that would also mean is maybe one of us had to go back and work for another hour or so to get some work kind of things done at night. So it was really, a balancing act. And I think one of the things I notice now after doing that for approximately a year, it's hard to focus, very hard to focus because you're jumping from activity to activity to activity, and it's about prioritizing like who needs help and what actions need to get done. But we're still doing that. But one of the things I've noticed is it's getting harder and harder to focus because it's almost like we can't turn one off and turn on the other. Like it's always a constant. We have, work responsibilities, we have school responsibilities. Fortunately, my son is able to participate in some extracurricular activities like some basketball and some esports, which he needs because it's really his only way he gets some social interaction, which is very important. So we lost the compartmentalization, and now it becomes a part of, we have these activities that we have to do in a day, and it just gets bounced from one to another, and maybe one day is more work and more home and vice versa. So I would say that part of it is becoming more difficult because it's makes your brain tired to have to think about that all the time.
Well, yeah, and I want to talk more about the hard to focus. But before we go there, I
Mhm.
just want to kind of double back on something that we were just talking about there, which is, um, this whole idea of you had to both you and your husband
Mhm.
had to kind of go back to your employers and say, look, based on my son's schedule, I really kind of need to have, these 2 hours in the morning where I'm unavailable, right? So I'm guessing at that point you had to kind of like block your calendar
Yep.
certain days from 8 to 10 so that nobody got onto your calendar, and they would have to understand, that as well, that for certain parts of the day, whatever they're going to be, I'm going to be a little unavailable.
Yep.
But I'm sure it worked the same thing with the people that work for you as well, right? So
Yes.
this
Yep.
had to become kind of a juggling act between not only kind of managing up, but also managing down and realizing and having empathy for the people that work for
Yep.
you. They're in the same situation you are, right?
Yep. That's
So I mean,
that's exactly right.
how, and,
And then
how-
it
and how does that all kind of work out? Because again, it's like everybody's going to have kind of some different schedules, I'm guessing too. So
well, then it becomes priorities. It becomes very, I would say my employer was great with being, they're like, whatever you need. It was almost like whatever you need, as long as you get the work, just here's what we need to get done by, this time. However, whatever you need to get that done, we'll figure it out. And so that really helped because then it became, prioritization. We need to get, XYZ project done by Friday. and so is going to be doing more of the work at night, and maybe so is going to be doing more of their work in the morning. If you talk through it and communicate and prioritize everything, it actually works out pretty well, because especially in an audit situation where there's, audit work and then audit review, you could plan it out pretty well where, maybe somebody was working on something later at night or after,
Mhm.
I guess now it's kind of hard to say what normal work hours are, but um, they would get their work done, maybe between 5 and 8 one night, but then it would be ready for me to review right away in the morning.
Yeah.
And if I got on, and I'm sure everybody else has stories where they were working, they were logged on at 5 or 6 o'clock in the morning, or 11, 10, 11, midnight at night. I'm sure people do that, but part of it was, a balancing act. So like I said, maybe they worked on theirs 5 to 8 at night, and then if I logged on at 7 in the morning, I could get the review done, and it actually, worked.
Well, because like you said, it does require that adaptability and
Yes.
flexibility, right? I mean, because
Yep.
I've got, for example, I've got somebody on my team who he's a night owl, right? I mean, he'll stay up sometimes until 2, 3, four
Yep.
o'clock in the morning. And so he prefers to do a lot of his work then. Well, I'm already way
Mhm.
asleep, you know, at that point. But again, it was that same thing of communicating with him, having those regular check-ins, right? Because we have regular
Yep.
check-in standing meetings for certain times of the week, just to make sure that there's enough of an overlap. But like you said, as long as we get the work done, then it doesn't really matter, right? Because
Mhm.
I know, like I was talking with him actually on Friday, and he asked me a question. He's like, "Yeah, I didn't finish this because I had this question on it, but you told me it wasn't due until the end of the month." And I realized Sunday's the end of the month, so I'll still get it done then. And it's like, Friday
Yep.
afternoon, he's talking to me about this, and he's like, so he was working Saturday, Sunday, to get it finished. But again, that's okay. That's the flexibility that he has in his schedule as long as the work gets done. So I think it sounds like one of the leadership lessons for us, if you will, is just get the work done and allow people to be flexible and have that empathy to realize that work hours are not going to be 8 to 5
Right.
like
Yes.
they always used to be, because we've got all this other stuff that has to get done
Mhm.
too. Mm.
Yep. And
Mm.
then if an emergency popped up, like it usually does in the audit world, then what I could do is say, it happened this morning. Threw something out there to my team. I'm like, I need this done today. Who can work on it? And then usually, people respond. I can do that. And as long as you tell them, this is now priority one. I know yesterday I said A was priority one, but now B is. As long as you tell folks what the priorities are and when it needs to get done, work gets done.
Yeah. Well, so and that prioritizing is important in setting the specific
Yeah.
deadlines, right? Like I said, I mean, when I said end of the month, I'm thinking Friday. He's thinking, no, end of the month is Sunday. I'm like, I don't care. I'm not going to do anything on it until Monday
That's
anyway,
great.
right?
Yep.
Yeah. So that probably all works out too. So let's go back to this hard to focus, because again, this is something, because I've done a lot of work in
Mm-hmm.
psychology and try to help share this with people too. But I know that one of the things that is very hard. You talked earlier about getting into the flow,
Mm-hmm.
and we do end up doing that. In fact, that's why things like multitasking can be so damaging for us, because it's interesting. There's actually been a lot of scientific research that's been done on this, and what they'll do is they'll give somebody an IQ test, right? And then they'll put them through these experiments, right? And so the experiments are usually having them multitask, interrupting them, doing all these kinds of things in this short period of time. And then at the end of that, they would give them another IQ test.
Mm-hmm.
not a surprise, IQs go down,
Mm-hmm.
right? So I like to say multitasking makes you stupid, right? Because it actually lowers our cognitive abilities. We're not able to perform as well the more that we get interrupted,
Mm-hmm.
right? So how have you dealt with, some of this kind of stuff? Because again, getting interrupted like that does lead us to, being irritable, angry,
Yes.
other
Yep.
stuff like that, where those emotions, anytime that we're hungry, angry, lonely, or tired, if we're any of those things, hungry, angry, lonely, or tired,
Mm-hmm.
when some stressor or trigger happens, we tend to react emotionally in a not so good way. Right?
Mm-hmm.
I think, before we were talking about the voice levels being elevated,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
Not that I've ever experienced that myself, but how do you kind of cope with that? And again, I mean, kind of seemingly we already have enough as leaders anyway in our job, but then when you compound everything with, your husband, your son, the schooling, the everything else, I mean, how do you kind of work through or deal with that?
Um, I had to learn what my own triggers were, and listen, and not only learn what they were, because in the pandemic, I would say there are different ones
Hmm.
that maybe you didn't notice that weren't there before. Like maybe before I could handle um, asking my son to brush his teeth 2 times. And then maybe, on a certain day, because of everything else, after one time, I would lose it. So it's just kind of recognizing what those triggers are, and then taking a breath. So like if I know, like I've had a long a long day at work, I know I need to have some 5-10 minutes, whatever it is, of me time, just to decompress before I talk to my son or husband about things that we need to do that evening, what we need to do as a family. Um, and that can be how I think that's been difficult during the pandemic, because all the boundaries and compartments are gone, because everybody's doing everything from one place. Excuse me. So that was definitely an adjustment to figure out how to recognize it sooner, and then take a time out.
I think that's, you two of the phrases that you just used there that I love is the timeout and breathe, right? Because again, I mean, it's a classic parenting skill, right? As you put your kid in timeout, if they're not acting or behaving in a way that we want them to, right? So we kind of separate them, not to isolate them or anything, but just to let them kind of get their emotions in check, right? So it's I love that idea though of kind of putting ourself in timeout, right?
Yep.
And that it's okay, like if we're talking and all of a sudden I start to recognize or feel that I'm getting triggered, we can continue to talk. But if we do that, voices might get elevated. I might say something that I regret later. And so it's better for us at that point for me to say, you know what, Don, just a minute. I need 5 minutes, and then let's pick up this discussion. I'm going to put myself in a timeout, right? Take that time, go away, have that me time, do whatever you need to kind of, balance back down what needs to be done. And the other one, with breathing is, yeah, sometimes we can't say I need a 5-minute timeout, but breathing, and another little trick that I love is the 7 seconds, right? And so you probably have heard me say this before, right? Where usually when we get triggered, our subconscious brain actually recognizes it 7 seconds before our conscious mind
Hmm.
actually picks it up. And so something as simple as breathing for 10 seconds or pausing in the conversation for 10 seconds can allow us to adjust. And again, people that are listening are probably thinking we're crazy talking about this, but just try it, right? Try breathing. Just stop and take deep breaths for a minute or a minute and a half, and you will be surprised the difference that you feel, right? And again, this is something that one of the techniques is called tactical breathing. Why is it called tactical breathing? Because they teach it to military SEAL, like Navy SEALs, special operations military people, because they get themselves in those times when they're freaking out. I'm sure if you're stuck stranded somewhere and people are shooting at you, you're going to be freaking out.
Definitely, I would be.
I would be, right? So it's a simple technique of even that you can do in 90 seconds to help you kind of focus, ground yourself again, and then be able to come back. So it sounds like that's been something that has been very helpful for you.
It has, and if you vocalize it, people understand, both at home and at work. If I say, I need 5 minutes, people have figured out what that means. And
You don't have
now
to
I
say
get,
why, right?
yeah, right. And even in a Zoom meeting, if I'm, Zooming with my team or with my boss, um, it's important to say, like, I just need it. I'm thinking about that for a minute. I'll respond in a minute. Or can I think about that one for a minute and I'll call you back, like in a work setting. But like at home it works too. And the amazing part is once one person does it and other people figure out the benefits of it, they start doing it too. And before you know it, everybody's being respectful of everybody else's, what's going on. And it really stops a situation from escalating.
Well, and I think what you just kind of explained there too is kind of one of the leadership concepts that I want to kind of beat into people too, is if you want to change the world, you know how you do it? You change yourself, and you start modeling the
Yes.
behavior that you want other people to follow. So in that instance, right, again, it's like, you can probably tell somebody's starting to get triggered, and it's like, oh, I need to put my husband in a timeout, right? I know my wife's probably said that several
Yep.
times, right? But we can't say, hey, you need to go take a timeout, right? Because if you do that, then that's kind of forcing the person. There's resentment, there's resistance
Mm-hmm.
at that point, right? But if we're the leader or we're in the situation, if we see ourselves starting to get triggered, or if we see the other person to start to get triggered, well, just put yourself in a
Yes.
timeout,
Yep.
right? Even if we don't need it, if we see that they need it, then ask for that, vocalize it, communicate it. Because when you do, then all of a sudden now you're also modeling that behavior that you want them to do.
Mm-hmm.
They see it's okay. You're doing it as the leader, so it must be okay. So the next time, maybe when they feel triggered, it's okay
Mm-hmm.
for them to say, hey, I just need 5 minutes, or I need to think about this for an hour. Let me get back to you.
Yep.
Right. Wow. Good stuff.
It is.
I mean, it's this whole time, I know for a lot of people it's been really hard, but it's also, for people like you, this has actually been a great opportunity, for you to communicate better, have the
Mm-hmm.
boundaries,
Yep.
some of these things that we should have had beforehand anyway, but we didn't because we weren't kind of
Yes.
forced into that situation, right? Yeah, good stuff.
And I think for the younger people, for all the children of various ages that are going through this, I know, and I've talked to my son's teachers a lot about this too. There's this constant worry of, oh, they're going to be a year behind from an academic perspective. And I always say, you know what? may or may not be the case. Humans are resilient and they can catch up. So we won't, we won't know the impact of that until much, much further down the road. But they're learning other very valuable lessons at an earlier age. Like, hopefully my son is seeing how we communicate at home and handle the stress and anxiety. And my hope is that when he is an adult, he will have these tools and be able to process them without even thinking about it because he learned how to do it at such a young age.
Well, yeah, I mean, because it's a blessing that you're giving your son some of these skills that we need as adults.
Yes.
A lot of us as adults are
Don't
trying
know
to
how,
learn the
yes.
lessons now, right?
Yes.
Because we're
Yes.
forced to, but like you said, I mean, and that's the way it is really with anything. For us to really learn, we have to practice it. We have to
Yes.
exercise it.
Yes.
And the more that we do that, the more unconscious those things become, right? It's that unconscious
Yes.
competence
Yep.
that we aspire to, that we all of a sudden just start doing things and we don't even recognize we're doing it because they become our habits.
Yes.
And that's just how we actually do that. So yeah, I'm excited to see how this younger generation is going to turn out, because I agree with you. I think these are actually good
Mm-hmm.
lessons for younger children to learn that will end up making them better
Yes.
adults as well.
I
Hmm.
think so.
Well, this has been a great discussion. I guess, before we kind of wrap up here, I just wanted to see too, are there any other things that you've kind of thought about that you'd like to share with people that you've found helpful, or that you think that would be good, for them to hear that we haven't already talked about?
I think the main thing is just use your resources. Like people, it's okay to ask for help. It's okay, I'm not a teacher. I can ask my son's teachers, how do I get him to do his homework without having to yell at him, all night. I can ask um, tell my boss I need help because I need to rearrange my schedule. Same thing with my team. I'm not going to be available between XYZ. It's okay for you to do the same thing as long as you communicate it. I think that's really the another learning point is just ask everybody. You may not think that you are in the same boat as everybody else, but you are, at least maybe not your neighbor, but there's somebody, you can find somebody who's in the same boat you are.
Well, and that's what I'm hoping, everybody who's listening now realizes, because again, a lot of times we feel isolated, we feel alone, we don't feel like everybody else is in the same boat that we are. And so we feel silly, we feel weak, we feel whatever, right? That, oh no, I can't ask for help because that would mean that I'm weak. Another thing that I learned a long time ago that I really believe is it takes more courage to ask for change and to actually make the change than it does to just continue doing what you've been doing,
Yes.
because it ends up leading to that anxiety. It gets to a point of a lot of times burnout, maybe depression, other things like that.
Hmm.
And so it's okay to ask for help, I
Yes.
think, is a huge thing, um, for people to realize we don't have to do this all by ourselves. There's other people in the same situation. There's
Yes.
other people who want to help, and all we have to do is reach out and find some of those other alternatives.
Yes. I
Hmm.
agree.
Good stuff, Don. I really appreciate you taking time and sharing and being open and honest with people of what
Hmm.
you've kind of gone through yourself, because again, I know that people are going to find this helpful, um, as well as we all get through this together.
Yes.
Right, we're going to get through this together,
Yes.
because humans are resilient, and we find a way to adapt
Yes.
and to be flexible and to work through whatever this life ends up throwing at us.
Agreed.
All right, well, thanks, Don. I really appreciate you, like I said, and just you know wishing you the best of successes. Again, we move through and we don't know what the future is going to hold, but obviously you've learned some things this last year that are going to help make you much more adaptable and flexible, regardless of what life
Mhm.
throws your way.
Yes. Thanks, Jason. I appreciate it.
Thanks.